Today, this afternoon, we're looking at a man named Absalom. He is, let's see, so far, we did look at Cain, technically along with Abel. And I was going to say he's our first, maybe truly anti-hero, if we want to put it that way. Of course, Cain definitely would beat that. But since we were technically looking at Abel in that lesson, at least in our list, Absalom's going to be pretty much the first character we see who we don't want to be like. We don't want to follow his example. We don't want to do the things that he did or think the way that he thought or make the kinds of decisions that he made. And a lot of times, those are just as powerful of examples as the opposite. So just as powerful as Jesus' positive example is, people's negative example, like Judas or like Cain that we saw a couple weeks ago, are equally powerful. It's just in the opposite way, opposite direction. Absalom, just in case you're not familiar with this man, he was one of David's sons. King David, the David. He was his son, one of his sons. Not his firstborn son, but he was one of the multiple sons that was born of David's polygamous marriage, or I guess to put it a different way, one of David's marriages, because they were kind of, it's not really a polygamous marriage. It's several different marriages that are just kind of put up with at the same time. He was David's third son, who was born to David by his fourth or possibly third wife. And he is a fascinating character. We're going to look a little bit about him as much as we can, or in as much detail as we can. We're going to leave out some of the details. But don't be fooled by his name, the meaning of his name. His name probably doesn't mean anything to you, but as I have it on the paper here, if you have one of the papers, his name means Father of Peace, or My Father is Peace, whichever way. Take your pick. I'm sure you've heard the word shalom. As far as Jewish, it's kind of one of those Jewish words, as from our perspective, that's what I would call it. Well, you can probably see how that's in his name, especially in the way it's written in English characters. The way the Hebrew name is written in English characters, it's got the H in there rather. Shalom, that's peace. So his name, and like Jesus said, Abba, is Father. So there's that root of Father in there. So as far as which one it would be, whether it's My Father is Peace or Father of Peace, Father in peace is in there. But as his life was lived out, it's hard to say if either one of those things is true in his life. As far as, his father David wasn't necessarily the father of peace, unless it's talking about God, of course, but that's maybe less likely. But Absalom himself was certainly not the father of peace, sadly. Not that he was always that way, but the events that unfolded that created his legacy are very sad, tragic. He's not a victim necessarily, but it's just one of those things that you can reflect on and just think it's unfortunate that these things had to happen. And it all starts in 2 Samuel 13, a very infamous chapter, not in a typical Bible study context, because it's one of those chapters that most people will run away from as much as they can, because it is such a Shakespearean, horrendous tragedy. And the things that unfold there are really more about David's other son, one of David's other sons, firstborn son. So very briefly, we cannot understand Absalom and the things, you can't, there's no way to understand 2 Samuel 14 through 18 if you leave out chapter 13, because that's why everything that's happening in Absalom's life is happening because of what happened in chapter 13 of 2 Samuel. And it is impossible to read the events of 2 Samuel 13 without being reminded of what Nathan told David back in chapter 12, which was, "The sword shall never depart from your house." I have repeatedly been a proponent of trying to help us to file the Bible in our minds as much as we can by chapter. Some people take a lot of pride, I think, in being able to quote Scripture, or somebody says 2 Corinthians 2:11, and as soon as they say that, they can tell you what it is, something like that. But I don't always think that's the most realistic way to try to remember Scripture, but I do think chapters is one of those ways. So things like Matthew 24 is, the destruction of Jerusalem, and then the second half is, the end of time, the day of judgment. Matthew 25, all about the day of judgment. Matthew 13, kingdom parables. 2 Samuel 11 is one of those chapters. It's the David and Bathsheba chapter. So 2 Samuel 11 is David and Bathsheba and all the horrendous events that happen there. 2 Samuel 12 is when Nathan confronts David about what happened in chapter 11. And then chapter 13 is almost the beginning of some of the fulfillment of what Nathan said to David. So Nathan said, because of what you've done here, the sword, you have been forgiven because you've repented, and asked God's forgiveness, but the sword will never depart from your house. And from this point on, the house of David is an absolute train wreck. Spiritually, emotionally, the family is totally, which we can't help but think a polygamous situation already lends itself to this kind of division and fighting against each other. Even in a monogamous marriage, children can be prone, even when they're grown, to snap at one another's necks when inheritance comes around and things like that, which is so abhorrent to think about, but it does happen. Whenever you got this wife and this wife and this wife, and she gave birth to these sons and these are her, it's just not a good situation. But the sword will never depart from your house is what Nathan said to David. And then we see that starting to unfold in chapter 13. His firstborn son gets an unhealthy obsession with one of his half-sisters, Tamar. And he was such a spoiled brat that he was just going around moping around, throwing himself a pity party because he realized there's no way he could ever get his half-sister the way he wanted her. So, just so happened, he had a friend, a cousin, that the text says was very crafty. He was a crafty man, a very crafty man. Jonadab was his name. He came up with a way for Amnon, that was his name, the oldest son, firstborn son of David, Absalom's older brother, half-brother. He came up with a way for him to get what he wanted. We kind of talked about in Esther, Haman's family didn't do him much good. They just catered to his fleshly desires. Hey, you want that and you can't get it? Well, why don't you just do this? We talked about Jezebel with Ahab. Ahab wanted that land, the man wouldn't sell it. Jezebel says, why don't you just kill him and then take it? And he's like, oh yeah, I'll do that. Well, a real friend would have said, Amnon, you got to cut this out. This is sick. Stop it. I won't tell anybody. You never speak of this again. Snap out of it. But Jonadab was a very crafty man, and he said, why don't you do this? And then you'll get what you want. And he did. And destroyed the life of his half-sister Tamar, who happened to be Absalom's full sister. So Absalom, the man we're studying here today, his Tamar was his full-blooded sister. Same mom, same dad. Amnon was their half-brother. Just shared David as their father. Well, Tamar's life, her whole life was ruined. She would never be able to marry. And she runs away and winds up at Absalom's house. or his quarters, his whatever, however that worked exactly. And he was going to take care of her as her older brother. But he would never get over this. In fact, David found out. Verse 20 of 2 Samuel 13 says that Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. So she would stay there forever, pretty much, because she would never be able to have her own family. She would never be able to bear children and be a mother. All of this was taken from her by Amnon for a fleeting moment's obsession. It says, when David heard about what happened, he was very angry. And we might read that and think, good. You know, he should be. The problem is, that's the end of it. Nothing happened. But what we read is, Absalom, David may have forgotten about it. Absalom never did. And he waited and waited and waited for 2 years. It says he tried to comfort his sister. But verse 22 says, Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. So this is setting up basically the rest of Absalom's life. It's all about this, that I think is a joint hatred of his brother and his father. And we're going to see both of them be the target, Absalom's target, for the remainder of what we read in his life. Absalom. He became obsessed with this. He was not the only person to blame, but anyway, he hated Amnon. Well, 2 years later, it became the time for sheep shearing, which was a very happy time. Joyous occasion. After 2 full years, that's a long time when you think about it. In one way, it's not. In another way, it is kind of a long time. 2 years passed by. And he invites all the king's sons. David says, I'm not going to come. We can't come to this. We'll be a burden. Just, you have my blessing, go ahead. Absalom says, well, at least let Amnon come. If all the king's sons won't come, at least let Amnon. David says, okay. Amnon, you're going, period. He pressed him until he allowed Amnon to come. Then he said, we're going to get Amnon good and drunk, and as soon as he's drunk, I'm going to give the word, and you're going to kill him. And that's exactly what they did. He got his vengeance. Revenge. He waited, probably planned 2 whole years. Finally got it. We mentioned, in our study of Esther how, taking somebody's life in this way, murdering somebody is wrong. Period. Did Amnon deserve justice? Yes. He didn't get it though, because Dad was just mad. And he didn't do anything. But Absalom took it upon himself to give Amnon what he thought Amnon deserved. And even if all of us agree that Amnon, kind of had it coming, something should have happened to him, it doesn't change the fact that Absalom had no right to do that. So he's killed his brother now. Fast forward a little bit. He runs away to, let me get it right here, Geshur. Yes, Geshur, to Talmai, the king of Geshur. Good little side note for you to write, if you write in your Bible, in 2 Samuel 13:37, Talmai was his maternal granddad. It's his mother's father. That's why he went there. He ran away to Grandpa, on his mom's side, of course. And he stayed there for 3 whole years. So he kills his brother, runs away. And David, just like he neglected to bring justice to Amnon, he eventually no longer felt the need to go and bring justice to Absalom. But he mourned for him day after day. Now, unfortunately, Absalom's story is not over. Because no matter what somebody might feel that he's justified for what he did to Amnon, you're not going to like him too much longer, I can guarantee it. He's a rascal. He is something else. Probably should point out also, he's the most beautiful man that's ever lived, apparently, okay? Because that's the way he was described. And that's going to show up here. I don't think it's mentioned in chapter 13, but in chapter 14, it's pretty much, it's going to play a role in some scheming that he does. And one of the great tools to have when you want to scheme and plot is to have a pretty face. I wouldn't know, but I've seen how helpful it can be for other people, and it seems to always be for evil. These great gifts sometimes, except Esther. We talked about Esther. She was beautiful in appearance. Everybody that looked at her, she was beautiful. And, somebody brought up, I wonder what she looked like because she was so beautiful. We don't get to know what she looked like. And then somebody makes the comment, I'll tell you who I want to know who they look like is Absalom. And that person was my wife, who's not paying attention, so I can get away with it. She's the one who said, I want to know what Absalom looked like, because he is said to not have a blemish from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, not a blemish on him, most beautiful man in the whole world, or whole country. Okay, fair enough. I'll let it slide. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that if David had done what should have been done, I mean, I don't think it's safe to say, it's just obvious, none of the rest would have happened because it all stemmed back. I mean, after all, literally, how could Absalom kill Amnon if he was already dead? So it literally wouldn't have been able to happen. And really the punishment for what he did would have been death. Like you say, eye for an eye, at the very least, something like that would have been in order as far as we're concerned, because you're right, it would have sort of put him in a similar position as her, except he was guilty. I mean, she was totally innocent and, didn't do anything for this to happen. But it's one thing for certain is David's negligence led to, it didn't mean Absalom was right, but it did contribute to Absalom's downfall, because the reason he was even tempted to do this is because David did nothing. So, yeah, it's a very valid point. Yeah, Dean? See, that's the thing. It's confusing. Kind of confusing whenever you got so many wives that, which one does it apply to? But it seems that, yeah, like we said, Absalom was the third son. So we don't really read, I forget his name. It's one of those things I would usually write down if he's referred to as the third son, but I don't think he is referred to as the third son that simply. But I forget the name of the one between them. But I think it's the one who is hardly ever mentioned. The only thing mentioned is that he was born, pretty much. And then we don't really read anything else about him. But either way, Absalom probably felt like he was entitled to a lot more than he was. And we're going to see that in this. So he runs away for 3 years. Eventually, he decides that it's time for me to come back. He gets a little help from Joab. If you remember from our journey through the Bible, Joab's a rascal in his own right, who was pretty loyal to David for the most part, but he showed his true colors later on. But he knew that David was just torn up about Absalom. So he goes and works out this whole scheme that was the ultimate purpose of it was to bring Absalom back to the city, to Jerusalem. And it works. So he brings Absalom back. Absalom returns to Jerusalem. But, there we go. But he doesn't get to go talk to his dad at all. And he didn't summon him. For 2 years go by, another 2 years. So 2 years between Amnon doing what he did to Absalom killing him. 3 years that he was in Geshur, up here, somewhere in that area. And now 2 years that he's back. And he is offended by the fact that he hasn't gotten to talk to his dad and go before the king in a more official way. It's not just like, Dad won't talk to me, this isn't right. But there's more to it than that, I think, with him coming before the king and being seen before the king and, all this optical stuff. So he sends a message to Joab to find out, what's going on. This is where it says, let's see, chapter 14, verse... Where's the verse? 25. In all Israel there was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head there was no blemish in him. And that goes without mentioning his hair. So much hair that he used to cut it at the end of every year, and it would weigh what seems to be, by translation or conversion, 11 grams. I can't even read my own writing here. Yeah, that's clearly, I don't think that's, I'm not sure if that's an accurate conversion. $20 shekels is 8 ounces, so 200. Yeah, 200 shekels. There's some complication and difficulty in converting these. So, based on one conversion, 5 pounds. That's a lot of hair, okay? And that is the point. Whether that's an accurate conversion, of course, it's, the conversions of that is not inspired. 200 shekels is inspired, but, how exactly that converts, because it's not as easy as, how many miles per hour is 200 kilometers per hour, because that's something that's used today, and there's a formula to do that. These Old Testament measurements, though, like a shekel in Old Testament time, it's not so easy as that. So, it changes, and then there's more math to do to figure it out. The point is, tons of hair. That boy had a head full of hair. Okay, must have been thick too. I mean, real thick, luscious. So he seems to have had it. He had it all. You say, nobody has it all. He might have this blemishless appearance, but he's something. He's got to have something, some kind of fault in his appearance. Maybe his fault is in his character, or he can't have it all. Absalom seemed to have it all. He was one of those people. Had it all. I bet he could eat everything he wanted and didn't gain an ounce. He's probably one of those people too that everybody hates because, I look at a piece of cake and I gain half a pound. So, yeah, he had it all, and this is about to start coming into play. He sent a message to Joab saying, what's going on? I want to go before the king. Joab didn't answer because Joab is Joab's man, and he's done. He helped Absalom. That's it. Kind of helped David by helping Absalom. He's got no interest in doing anything else. Absalom is not the kind of man who's going to take no for an answer. Similar to his brother that he killed, ironically. But anyway, Joab didn't answer. Well, here's what Absalom decided to do, like any of us would, right? What do you do when somebody doesn't answer your call? Probably what Absalom did. You say, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to burn his whole fields down. Impressive, huh? This, I don't know how you describe a man like this. He doesn't play around. He didn't answer him one time. So it says he had his servants go burn his field down, or burn up all his fields. Yeah, it's crazy is what it is, but it got the point across. So Joab goes and he says, hi, Absalom. Why exactly did you burn my fields? Of course, here it all goes. Now Joab's sort of coerced into helping Absalom get back with the king. They have this reunion. It's all, kissy, huggy. Everything's going great. That is, until David sort of reinstated him to some extent. It says he got a horse, he got a chariot, he got 50 men. And from that point on, it was his custom, or at least it had been his custom, to sit at the gate and flatter people. He's making friends. He's telling people things they want to hear. And he's up to something. If you were a bystander or somebody who came across him, you might get the impression, this guy's up, I don't know what's going on. This guy's up to something. Something doesn't feel right. He's up to something. Yeah. He is a politician. That's exactly what he is. He's got charisma. See, I said he's got it all. Even though he was a jerk. He's a selfish, spoiled jerk. But he still had that charm. And boy, is that dangerous. Yep. Probably both. It may have been there and it got worse. Because like I pointed out at the beginning, we see two primary targets. Joab was a sort of secondary target. Two primary targets in Absalom's wrath. His brother, out of vengeance for his sister, and his dad. Why his dad? Why? Well, there's really no connection. Surely it just wasn't because he didn't let him come before him for 2 years. I think that's the most natural conclusion. He's not willing to let it go, that his dad didn't do anything to help in response to what he did to his sister, which is it is outrageous. If anybody else heard of that, how could you not do anything? That is unacceptable. And yet he had no right to take matters into his own hands. But he resented his dad. So what he's doing is he's working to steal the throne from his dad. Not just from his older brother, assuming that he was still alive, since we don't read about him much, if he's the brother that I'm thinking of. But he's stealing it from his dad, even if he was next in line. That's a big no-no. You don't do that. You wait. His dad knew that. Remember with Saul? Saul was trying to kill him the whole time. David said, I will not lift a hand against him. God's anointed him, and I'll wait. I feel like I was asked this and I found it out and I can't remember. Possibly. You would think, because even, no matter what the situation was, he wasn't the next in line after Amnon. So regardless, unless that other brother was out of the picture, he wouldn't be next. But I don't know, I can't remember the exact time frame of when David would have promised Bathsheba, or that when Solomon was born. I did the math once upon a time, but I don't have it here in front of me, so I'm not sure when that all... I know that Solomon's birth is recorded right there, but sometimes that's the way the Old Testament works, is goes ahead and records sort of the end, or a relevant fact, even though it didn't happen then. But I can't remember if that's the case with Solomon's birth or not. The impression we get, though, is that none of that even mattered to Absalom. None of it would have made any difference. He was working to take this from his dad. That's what he wanted to do. So he's a patient man. If anything, there's his redeeming quality. Well, he's selectively patient, right? Joab doesn't answer his call one time and he burns his fields. But as a rule, when he wants something, he's patient. And that's not necessarily a good thing in his case. He was willing to wait 2 years for Amnon to be in the perfect spot. He was willing here to take his time. He's winning people over. And he's planting little seeds like this. If I was king, I'd do something about that. That's about the schemiest, slipperiest thing that you could plant in somebody's mind. Listening to their disputes that they would take to the king, but he finds out about them and he's like, and everybody, he tells them, verse 3, chapter 15 says, see, your claims are good and right, but there's no one designated by the king to hear you. Oh, I wish I was designated. You see? So it could be two opposing people that are in a single dilemma or dispute, and he listens to one. He says, your claims are good and right, but there's nobody to hear you. And then the other one tells him, he's like, your claims are good and right. You see? Just crooked as crooked can be. And it's all for the purpose of trying to scheme his way to the throne. Moving along forward, he does end up rebelling against his dad in the fullest sense of the term. He tricks his dad, and he gets a crew of people to Hebron, and he says, when we get to Hebron, you hear the trumpets or whatever, everybody is to declare Absalom is king of Israel in Hebron. And that's what he does. And he chases his dad. His dad is forced. The actual king is forced to run away from Jerusalem. That's how big of a movement this was, apparently. He had this force with him, and maybe this zeal that scared David away. He ran away, and it took a while. But ultimately, they were battling one another, and one of Absalom's great prides and joys ended up being the end of him. That luscious, beautiful hair. He's running away on horseback. And one of the things that you don't want to happen when you're riding on horseback is to suddenly realize that there's no horse underneath you anymore. Right? Especially when you're not on the ground. Here he is. He's trapped. He's stuck in a tree because of that hair. 20,000 men died that day, and he's caught in a tree. David says, mission number 1, you bring back my son alive, period. Tells Joab. Tells the others, bring my son back alive. Joab finds out he's in that tree, and he goes, rebukes the servant who actually did what he was told and didn't kill Absalom. He goes and he just kills him right there. So again, Absalom deserved what he got, but Joab had no right to do that. He had been told by the king. And, maybe he had no faith in his king to do anything to Absalom. He saw he didn't do anything to Amnon. Why would he do anything to Absalom? Even though he was a traitor and a rebel. So he did it anyway. And David's, the cry that finishes chapter 18 of 2 Samuel, you could hear it. You practically hear it. Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, oh Absalom, my son, my son. What is that? 5 times he says the words, my son, screaming. It's just, you can practically hear it. Yeah. Yeah. Very sad. Yep. And unfortunate. Well, we're pretty much out of time, but I had 2 different papers, one different than the one I gave to you, so I need to get myself lined up here. I guess the lessons then at the end. Our chief glory can become the cause of our greatest shame. Certainly was true in Absalom's case. His hair, mainly. But that can be true of other things too in our lives. The things that we cherish the most can actually end up undoing us, especially if the things we cherish the most are things of the world. Worldly, human, earthly things. Lay up your treasures on earth. It just shows that your heart's on the earth, as Jesus said. So don't fall into that like he did, although his was literally physical on his own body. Our choicest endowments and most cherished gifts can become our greatest temptations. This is something that I have lamented many times, how some of the greatest skills and blessings and gifts that people have, how much good they could do. But instead they use them for evil, or they use them for themselves. That charm that he had, how much good. You know, not in a deceitful way, because charm can be used deceitfully many times, and it often is. I would probably say more so than not. But that gift in itself, how much good that could do when you're trying to convert people and teach the gospel, preach the gospel, teach. But so many people use it for their own ends, to deceive people, to lead people astray and things like that. Our gifts, like ourselves, need to be rewashed every day in the fountain of God's truth and guarded and sanctified by prayer if they are to be fit for the highest service. In our minds, at least, in our hearts, we need to check ourselves. Check things. Keep ourselves in check and alignment with God's truth. If Absalom had done that, he would have been more like Mordecai and less like Absalom. Number 4, a man should not let his role outside the home detract from his role inside the home. That was more like David. Maybe related to David. He was a great king as a rule, but we see some great shortfalls as a father in his own home. A father should know what's going on in his household. Again, David, come on. At least let Amnon come. And he didn't know. That wasn't a red flag. Wait a minute. Why are you so adamant about Amnon coming? What is this? And even if he didn't get to the bottom of it, he could have said, no. I don't know what you're up to, but something's going on. No. But he's like, okay. Amnon, get your shoes on. Get out there. You're going with it. And he died. He was killed because of that. Know what's going on. Negligence of rightful justice provokes rogue vengeance. Not that it's justified, but it does happen. And we see that in Absalom's life. But again, can't stress enough, even when justice is not served, we as citizens have no right to take the law into our own hands. Ambition, when unchecked by ethical, moral, and spiritual principles, is a dangerous thing. And that's not to say, being ambitious is bad, because, in one sense it's not, but that's not usually what ambition means. It has a negative connotation in itself. Selfishness or self-serving ambition. I'm trying to elevate myself. If we don't check that kind of ambition by ethical and moral spiritual principles, we're putting ourselves in harm's way spiritually. And that goes for anything. Everything should be checked by ethical, moral, and spiritual principles. And that's what should separate the Christian from the people of the world. We have principles that everything we do is going to be according to those principles. That alone will impress some people, because a lot of people today don't have principles. And you don't know what they're going to do. And, they might do this, but then they might be very inconsistent with their choices because they don't have a set of principles that they live by. And when they see somebody that does, they're at least impressed. They may not agree, but they are at least impressed, like, wow, you really do. You actually have principles. You act based on the things that you believe. That's how we should be and should check everything by those principles. The things that I believe, the things that I generally do, check those things based on God's will to make sure that they are right. And finally, Absalom's downfall was due ultimately to a lack of applying the principle of Romans 12, 17 through 21. Of course, Absalom didn't know Romans 12, 17 through 21 because it didn't exist. But the principle was based on the Old Testament anyway. There, Paul says, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. And then he said, beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. That is the thing. Was what Amnon did evil? 100%, 1,000%. As evil can be. But was murdering Amnon evil? 100%. Just as evil. When at the end of the day, murdering someone in cold blood is just as evil as anything that person may have done that made you want to murder them. So, Paul says, don't repay evil for evil. Don't stoop to that. And then he says, don't avenge yourselves. Leave it to God. Somebody wrongs you, put Jesus' teaching in there with it. Pray for them, do good to them, love them, do unto them as you would have them do unto you. And then as Paul says here, don't avenge yourself. You leave it to God. God's God. Stop trying to be God. Absalom, aside from trying to be the king, he was also trying to be God, taking people's lives at will. But if he would have applied the principles, which were grounded in the old law as well, leave it to the wrath of God. God will take care of it. That's also the point of one of the parables Jesus told. It's sometimes mistaken to be teaching something else, but we'll see it eventually when we get there. There's good and evil people out in the world, but we, the other people of the world, have no business just plucking them out of the world. These people are not Christians, and they won't become Christians. What should we do? Let's just kill them. That's wrong. There's some religious systems that do that. You will become one of us, or you will become dead. It's not right. Leave it to God. God will take care of it. God knows who is who. Vengeance is his. So Absalom fell into the downward spiral he did because he didn't take that to heart. But instead, he took it all into his own hands. Avenged himself. Sure, he was avenging his sister, but it was for himself too, because he didn't like what Amnon did. Probably could add another one in there. Being pretty don't make you right, You might win a lot of arguments. You might not ever get into an argument because nobody wants to. How can you argue with somebody that pretty? Yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, doesn't make them right.